Thank you for that introduction, Gordon, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to talk around the topic of evil spirits in the countryside. But I mean, this isn't a talk about cryptozoology. What I'm interested in is the way that certain entities, we've been frightened of, and how those entities have changed over the generations. I first became interested in this topic when I wrote up the book Alien Spirits. And this was a product of seances I had with an Edinburgh medium, Ray Todd. And Ray was a physical medium. He used to bring through these faces of bodies. I was here and he was there, and he'd bring through these kind of physical bodies. And a lot of them were simply human beings or human spirits, as I guess you'd say. And that was interesting, it was intriguing, obviously, but I kind of identified with it, being interested in the spiritualist subject. But what was far more intriguing was that they brought through these alien beings. And some of these alien beings were lizard-like. And I found this quite disturbing, and I started asking myself, well, why do I find that disturbing? They were kind of intelligent beings. I mean, they'd look at you, none of these spirits spoke, by the way, but they'd look at you, but I find it disturbing. I said, so why do I find that disturbing? Is it because of their form, or is it because something I'm completely not used to? And so I've been fascinated for a long time by the changing creatures that threaten us. In the past, there were dragons, vampires, kelpies, among many others. Today, it's alien abduction, thousands across the world. But where have all the monsters of the past gone? Are they still there? We're just not identifying them? Or are they appearing in different forms? I'll just mention, because there's one creature that kind of stands out that nobody ever seems scared of, and that is the unicorn, one of Scotland's national animals, if you like. Okay, I know a lot of people say unicorns have never existed and people just imagined them. But if they did imagine them, it's one of the creatures that seem to be out there, but one of the creatures that actually seem to be protecting people rather than threatening people. So that creature kind of stands out for some reason. So what do we mean by monsters? To my mind, it's everything inexplicable which appears solid in form, but inhabits that twilight world between our reality and other worlds. Sometimes you get people using this word liminal to describe the kind of separation between, say, this world and the world of the supernatural. It's not a word I use because I found it too confusing. But we do have a kind of, double-edged view of monsters. Take a look at dragons. These are friendly monsters these days. They appear in cartoons and, everything like that. But in the past, dragons were seen as threatening. And, it wasn't just a question of they being threatening. They were there in the countryside. I mean, the most famous example, obviously, is St. George and the dragon. St. George killing a dragon. And these dragon stories, I mean, they're not just one event. They happened all over the place. I mean, in Scotland, there were various stories, traditions of people going out, confronting dragons, killing dragons, and dragons destroying crops, destroying cattle, and so on. So they did exist down in the lowlands of Scotland, up in the highlands of Scotland. It's just the kind of memory of tradition of these dragons has kind of faded away. But they were very real to people in medieval times. But today they seem to have disappeared, and as far as I'm aware, nobody sees dragons, or at least I've never heard of anybody reporting seeing a dragon recently. But when you think about it, it is kind of odd when they were so real to people in the past. And again, here's another transformation, the amazing kelpies. near Falkirk there, which I guess most people have been out to see. And you can actually get inside them, obviously. I mean, they're a fantastic sight. I remember when I used to drive to Edinburgh to see my parents, saw the kelpies being built and wondered what they would look like when they were finished. And that's a picture of the kelpies at night. And, get people going there and say, isn't that fantastic? These wonderful kelpies. The transformation. Because in the past, kelpies were seen quite differently. They were seen as quite threatening. And my mother, who was born in 1926, I remember her telling me that her granny had said to her, because they lived in Aberdeen, down at a place called Fitty, or Footdy as they anglicised it. I remember my mother telling me she'd been told, don't go near the water or the kelpie will get you. So the idea of the kelpie being threatening, occurred right up to really quite recent times. And the kelpie was seen as quite a vicious creature. It was one of these shapeshifters. It would appear as a horse out of the river or a loch. And it would come up to people, pretend to be friendly, suggest they got on the back, get on its back, it appeared as a kind of horse. And once it got people on its back, it would dive into the water and drown people and eat them up. And this included children as well. So it was seen as quite a threatening beast. And as recently as the 1800s, I don't even know Loch Venacher up in the Trossos, but there's a story there that a kelpie, it distilled the water, it could create this massive kind of flood of water which would sweep inland. And on one occasion, in 1815, it swept away a dozen children. And this is quite a recent tradition. But since then, where have all the kelpies gone? Because they seem to have completely vanished from, consciousness. Nobody talks about kelpies anymore. Which is kind of strange when you think about it. You had these really powerful traditions which now have vanished. We don't see kelpies anywhere, at least nobody's told me that we've seen any, but we have this kelpie statues near Falkirk, which means we completely changed our vision of what kelpies were. So why has that happened? Loch monsters are so common, well, Loch Ness is so common today, it's become a massive tourist attraction. I don't know if anybody sees it as threatening, but the original story is obviously quite threatening when people were being attacked swimming across the river, back in 545 AD, I think it was. But today we seem to have a different view of the Loch Ness monster. It's kind of a friendly thing, you get Nessie and so on. But I mean, there have been so many traditions in lochs across Scotland of loch monsters. And in the past they were seen as threatening. St Mary's Loch down in the Borders, there's a story there where a monster came out of a loch and took away cattle from around about the local area and it dragged them into the water. And so you get quite a few stories like that. But in recent times, that has kind of changed a bit. And the Loch Ness monsters, if you like, put across as quite a friendly being, something almost like a little pet, So views of these kind of strange animals do change over the generations. And one of the things that interests me is that, the Loch monsters have only kind of re-emerged as something we should be looking at in comparatively recent times, because Loch Ness only really became a kind of attraction for monster sightings in the 1930s when they built roads around the side of it. Before then, sightings were very few and far between. Elvis the Mystic. I put this in for a number of reasons which I'll just come to. This is a book actually that my brother gave me, And when it arrived, I thought, the occult Elvis? I mean, it seems so ridiculous, you know. I mean, you have this contradiction between this great kind of singer with massive reputation, and then somebody who was interested in the occult. And I thought, surely this has always been made up, you know, or fantasified or whatever. But when I actually started reading it, I was absolutely amazed to discover that actually Elvis was interested in supernatural. He took all these kind of yoga-type courses, Eastern mysticism courses, and he was really interested in the thing. And one of the most fascinating things to me was that he was fascinated by the colour blue. Because according to the tradition, or the story that was told about his birth, because as you probably know, he was born as a twin, and his twin brother Jesse died just after birth, and Elvis always felt this kind of attachment to his dead twin. But when Elvis was born, his father, Vernon, went out and saw this blue light in the sky. And Elvis, in later life, he associated blue with healing properties. And he would actually try to heal people by imagining the colour blue was travelling down people's body. Why am I interested in that? Because of this story, which kind of merges this idea of fairies and alien abduction. Because back in the 1980s, I'll start again. In the 1990s, a woman witness came to me and told me this story, which had happened to her when she was a child, 10-year-old child. And she'd gone out into the woods. She lived in a farm in Persia, legal Persia, and she used to go out into the woods and wander around. And on this particular day, she did her usual walk into the woods. Now she came to this spot that she'd been to in the past, and then she was confronted by these 10 small blue beings. I've just mentioned in Scotland, blue is a colour that has long been associated with the supernatural. You get the blue men in the Minch, mermaid, you get the blue stain, the devil's stain, and all that kind of thing. So blue was associated with the supernatural. And she saw these blue beings, and she was frozen to the spot. She couldn't actually move. And then the next minute she remembers this beam of light coming down, and she was lifted up into this spacecraft. And there she was confronted by these various alien beings. And after a while, they kind of examined her or whatever. After a while, she was actually beamed back down. And when she landed back on Earth, she was able to move. So she ran all the way home. But when she got home, she discovered that she'd actually been away for hours. She thought she'd only been away for a short time, but she'd been away for hours. And her family were just about to ring up the police to report her missing. And afterwards she felt unwell for a few days. She was in bed. But this memory stuck with her for the rest of her life. And when I spoke to her, she was in her 30s. She was actually a social worker. She had nothing to gain from telling anybody this story. But she was just frightened that this same experience would happen to her child. But what fascinated me was this kind of mixture of traditional fairy tale confronting confronting blue gnome-like beings in the countryside, and then being abducted by what seemed to be kind of spacecraft. It is a strange mixture, isn't it, of past tradition and modern, if you like, well, it's becoming a tradition now, of alien abduction. Evil in the countryside, as I mentioned, talking around this subject because I think it brings in various things. Friendly nature spirits. When I say nature spirits, I'm using that word because it always sounds better than fairies, gnomes, elves and pixies, which people start thinking, gosh, what a load of fantasy. But we have this opinion of, the fairies being good friends, the fairy godmother, the tooth fairy and so on. But should we be more wary of them? What do they actually represent? What kind of entities are they? Can we be so sure that what we see is actually what they are? This is a current view of fairies, which has been probably since about the 19th century. So just a little bit. This is the traditional view of these small little creatures. This, as you probably recognise, is a photo of the Cottingley fairies, which has been long recognised now as a kind of fraud. And these two young girls made up these photos from cuttings out of a scrapbook, and they fooled a lot of people, including Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote a whole book about the fairies and how he believed in them. So that's a sort of current view of fairies, these small, delicate beings, who do good to the world. I should mention that the girls, or at least one of the girls, said, "Oh, we did see fairies there, but we found it difficult to convince people, so we actually made up these photographs just so that we could convince people." So they did think they had genuine encounters with fairy beings. But it is odd because, of course, fairies have a long, or gnomes, and they have a long tradition in Scottish life. And this was more like the traditional view of fairies in the past. And they weren't small little things that flitted through the air. They were actually small human beings, a bit odd-shaped, but recognisably human. But they had these supernatural powers, so they could, walk through walls. They could come into houses and took away babies and replaced them with other babies. And they had a whole range of supernatural powers. And they kind of lived underground as well. And not only did they live underground, but they had these huge cities, and they lived life like our lives, except they were that little bit different with their supernatural powers and abilities. And so, what was the threat from fairies, or these kind of strange fairy-like beings? Yeah, they came into people's houses, they supposedly ruined the milk and took babies away. But more interestingly, from our point of view, was that they abducted people. And one of the most famous abductions in Scottish history is that of Thomas the Rhymer. And Thomas actually was a real person who lived in medieval times, and he was famous for predicting things, and he did a whole pile of predictions. But like a lot of these predictions, like Nostradamus and all those predictions, it's difficult to know which ones actually were made at the time, and which ones were later written up and kind of assigned to Thomas as his possible potential predictions. But the thing that's most remembered maybe about Thomas, apart from all these predictions, is his abduction by the Fairy Queen. And if you go down to the borders near Melrose, you can still walk up to the actual spot, now marked by a stone, where Thomas is allegedly to have been abducted. Curiously, Sir Walter Scott, our greatest writer, he built Abbotsford, which you may have visited. He built it there because he thought it included the spot where Thomas the Rhymer had been abducted, because Sir Walter Scott was really into all these Scottish traditions and fairy tales. But there is obviously dispute about where Thomas was abducted. The interesting thing that Thomas was abducted, taken underground to one of these fairy kingdoms, and when he re-emerged several years later, after being abducted, he thought he'd only been away for a few days, when in fact he'd been away for years. And fairies were everywhere. Well, like the dragons of old and the kelpies of old and so on. The fairies had their fairy knowes, which still exist right across Scotland. You know, the remains of, but they had them everywhere. I've just mentioned Carlton Hill in Edinburgh because it's, you know, quite a prominent landmark today, and a lot of people visit it. But in the past, it was seen as one of the fairy places where the fairies had their cities underground. And one of the most well-visited spots today, specifically because of its fairy association, is the Fairy Now near Aberfoyle, where people hang up rags and so on, because it was believed, you know, if you hung up a rag there or a bit of cloth and you rubbed it on your body, hung it up, if you had some kind of illness, and as that rag sort of disintegrated, then, you know, so would your illness. Problem is today that people put up rags that don't disintegrate, and so that doesn't actually work anymore. But I'm glad to say I visited the Fairy Now a few years ago to discover they'd completely wiped away all the rags and everything that had been collected there over the years, you know. So I bumped into somebody from the Forestry Commission. I said, why have they done that? Oh, they were tidying up the place. I said, well, that's been a tradition for, you know, hundreds of years, to visit this spot, the Fairy Now, because of the Reverend Robert Kirk, who claimed that he'd encountered fairies there. Not only had he encountered fairies there, but he'd taken underground and visited one of these fairy kingdoms. So I did complain to them and got in touch with the press, and that appeared in practically every paper in the UK. So the next minute they put the ropes back up, you know, so people could start putting their rags back on, little messages. So I was glad that we managed to keep that tradition going. I visited there with Ian Shanes, who you might have had a reading from out there. I think he's still out there. And when I was there, it was Ian. I was interested to see, well, are the fairies actually still there? What will we see? And according to Ian's account, yeah, the fairies were still there. There was a fairy queen there. You know, they were still occupying the area. But they bitterly resented human beings visiting the place. Because in their mind, it was their particular place. You know, why should humans invade it and take it over? And I think that reflects other people's experiences. Those people have been in contact with the nature spirits, that it's not all goodness towards us. There's this feeling of resentment against human activity, humans destroying the kind of places that they live in. And Hugh Miller, who probably not a well-known figure today, but Hugh Miller in the 19th century was a very well-known Scottish figure. He's one of the founders of modern geology. But that apart, he also was a folklorist. You know, he had his own supernatural experiences. His father had drowned. His father was a fisherman who drowned, and Hugh had the experience of lying in bed and seeing the spirit of his father actually walking into the house. So this obviously intrigued him, and over the years he documented a whole range of folklore traditions, ghost traditions and so on. And he got really quite interested in the subject. He was one of these 19th century sort of polymath type of people involved in just about everything, you know, as people were in the 19th century. But Hugh, who lived up in Crombie, he moved down to Portobello in Edinburgh, and a house there was well known, quite well off by later years. But he started having these experiences of being threatened. And one of the kind of creatures that he believed were threatening him were nature spirits, like the fairies. He believed had invaded his garden and were threatening him, and he was getting all these terrible, terrible nightmares. And one day, he was found shot in his front room at his desk. And it was believed that this experience of being threatened by the nature spirits had actually driven him off his head, and he'd actually committed suicide simply because of it. So I mean, the idea, of nature spirits carrying on a kind of vendetta against the human race, against certain individuals for whatever reason, kind of lived on, and to a certain extent, it does live on even today. Robert Crombie, another person who was interested in the whole nature spirit phenomenon. Robert Crombie, I don't know how he started off being interested in the topic, but he was in the Royal Botanic Gardens in Edinburgh. He lived near it. And one day while he was there, suddenly he encountered all these various strange creatures, like a centaur, goblins, elves, a whole range of things. And first of all, he got quite friendly with them. He started giving them the names. The centaur he called Kronos. It was a sort of young centaur. And he wrote down, he documented all this. There's even a book, that was produced by a chap I knew all about it. He documented all this, piles of stuff. And he said, these creatures had come to his house, and he got to know them. He was really quite friendly with them and so on. And eventually, he became involved with others and set up the Findhorn Foundation, which is quite well-known, worldwide known these days, up in Findhorn in the north of Scotland there. But the interesting thing is that Crombie, he was quite influential in finding the location for the Findhorn Foundation, because he actually spoke to the nature spirits, and there was a nature spirit who recommended that they actually use this particular location because it had all these good vibes. So Crombie was really quite friendly with these nature spirits to start off with. And that's the centre. I was out there, I had the Kelpies. I was out there with my wife Evelyn just the other day that I was interested to see. I did take a photograph, but I forgot to upload it. They've got a centaur made out of wood. So, centaurs today are still kind of like an image. But we don't believe them to be actual creatures. But in the past, obviously they did. As I said, Crombie claimed to have encountered one. I don't know if it was all his imagination, but he did, as I say, document it quite thoroughly. Plus, he also had alien encounters as well. He met a couple of aliens. An alien came into his flat. He met an alien on the beach one day. So, again, you get this kind of traditional experience of the nature spirits plus alien entities today, which suggests there was a kind of crossover. And again, what kind of form are these creatures taking? Is it just a form we recognise? Do we change our recognition of what's threatening us or strange? One of the most bizarre experiences that Crombie had, and again, kind of emphasises maybe the potential threat that we're faced, was on the Mound in Edinburgh, which I guess a lot of us have been to at one time or the other. And Crombie was walking down the Mound when he encountered this being, which came up and put his arm around him. He said he felt this kind of hairiness against his body. And when he turned round, he saw that this creature, which he described as Pan, standing by his side and put his arm around and walked down the road with him and started speaking to him. And what Pan was trying to do was to kind of convert him, according to Crombie, convert him to believing in him, as the saviour of the world. But Crombie, who was a religious person, wouldn't have anything to do with him. Although this creature kept trying to convince him that, he was going to do good to the world and there was nothing wrong, and he'd been totally misunderstood. So Crombie eventually came to the thought or conclusion that maybe this creature was trying to take over his soul. And was this just a general theme with the nature spirit? Were they trying to take over people's soul? Not just, if you like, being there, but actually sucking out something, the spirit out of people, and turning them into something else, something evil. So, to deal with another issue connected to all this, the disappearing thousands. Over 170,000 people disappear in the UK every year. That's one every 90 seconds. Are we safe? On that basis, we should maybe all go carefully. 96,000 are adults, 75,000 children. In Scotland, 20,000 missing person investigations are carried out each year, or around 55 per day. Out of a population of only 5.5 million, it's a staggering figure. All right, I know in the vast majority of cases, people do turn up, and it is just missing person reports, rather than absolutely missing people. But, in the past, how would people have seen all these disappearing people? There was a belief that people were being abducted by fairies, by kelpies, and by a whole range of other strange creatures. So maybe they would have interpreted that as, a threat from these, in inverted commas, monsters. But today, how do we see it? Well, over in the USA, of course, there are a large number of alien abductions. So maybe people would say, well, part of that is alien abductions. But today, can we say that every single missing person isn't something which has a strange explanation? I'm just curious about it, as to why, we have all these disappearing people. As I said, most people turn up, but some never turn up. So where do they go? There's a bit of a curiosity. And in the past, I'm sure they've been put down to some kind of strange abduction. As I mentioned, abductions by fairies and aliens. There has been a kind of crossover. In the past, we would have recognised abductions by these strange creatures. Today, we're kind of refocusing that on alien beings. But what are alien beings? They're just these strange creatures in another form. How do we know that what we see is actually what's there? Because we can't be sure, as I said, with Ray Todd used to see all these figures. If I've been out in the wild and saw these things, what's the interpretation of it? We don't believe in dragons or kelpies anymore. Maybe we just see these creatures in a sort of different form. It's just the same entity taking on a different shape just to fit in with the kind of technology or our own current worldview. And if you think of all the strange alien entities that have been reported, some look completely and utterly weird. There's a lot more. And that's only a sample of the kind of things people have seen. So, are people actually seeing this whole range of alien beings? Or is it just people's minds, if you like, focusing and making something out of some kind of strange entity, something unrecognizable that our mind transforms into something that we can, if you like, make a little bit of sense of. And in the past that would have been a monster, of the countryside. Today it's something a little bit different. It's an alien entity from, who knows where across the universe. And here's another creature which we tend not to see these days. What would you say to a vampire? Well, Bram Stoker, who actually did visit Scotland quite frequently, would tell me to avoid them. And Scotland had its own vampires. Today, of course, vampires have become another funny kind of creature. They appear in cartoons and all kinds of Disney-type things as well. So, they've become used to seeing it as a friendly being, more or less. But of course, in the past, quite different. I'm not saying, we don't see it like that today, but we have this kind of two-edged view of vampires. The infamous bloodsucker. And of course, not just the bloodsucker, but the flying creature who practically get into anywhere, through any window, to come and attack you. And of course, there's a kind of, strange attraction that the vampire has, particularly for women and so on. So you get this whole kind of mixture of the bloodsucker, but again, at the same time, the kind of guy who's, sexually attractive, whereas the woman, it's always never an ugly female vampire, it's always a beautiful female vampire. Looks a bit like Marilyn Monroe or something. And to go back, Scotland did have its, we've forgotten about this, but at one time Scotland was a hotbed of vampire activity. There's a lot of stories from across Scotland in the past, particularly down in Dumfriesshire, where a vampire was rampant during the night, going around eating, killing people, eating them, sucking their blood and so on. And there's a well-documented story about them, a couple of brothers going to where they believed this vampire had been buried. They thought they recognised the person who was, acting out this vampire, who had become a vampire. So they went to the cemetery where he'd been buried. They started to dig him up and found he was just lying just a little bit below the ground. So when they opened up scraped off the earth, they found him lying there and blood dripping down, this is the story, blood dripping down him and looking quite fresh and new, so to speak. So they thought, well, this must be him. So they basically dug him up, chopped him up, burnt him, to be absolutely sure his ashes were scattered. So yeah, Scotland had this tradition, and the other bits of, there's other stories about a couple got married and then the husband died, and when the woman went, she couldn't bear to see him, as it were, being buried, so she went there, dug him up, and she found he was still fresh and, the blood dripping down his mouth or something. Oh, he's a vampire. So there's a lot of stories like that. I mean, that's all been shifted to Eastern Europe now, which is kind of far away and used to be considered strange. But Scotland had its own vampire stories. But today, we don't expect to see a vampire if we wander around the countryside. So again, why? Were there never any vampires? Is it just that, we see vampires as something else these days? Yes, this is another vampire connection which carried on into the 19th century. William Christie Miller was an individual, strange individual from Edinburgh. Just mentioning that there was some talk about him being a vampire because he was a very odd being. His mausoleum's actually in Edinburgh, near Craigmillar, I think. I have visited it, but I can't remember exactly where it is off the top of my head. But when he died, he actually specified that he was to be buried 40 feet down in an iron coffin with a stone slab on the top. And this is the top of his mausoleum, and it's got all kind of Egyptian carvings around it. It's a very strange kind of thing. And the rumour at the time, was that it wasn't so much to keep him in as he was worried about getting out, because for some reason, it was suspected that he was a vampire. I just mention that because there's a curious tale. Some years later, a policeman was walking around the mausoleum, found one of the doors open, went inside and saw this creature moving around at the bottom, this 40-foot bottom shaft. So of course he slammed the door shut and ran away. So was William Christie Miller a vampire? Is it just a rumour that had got into his head? This story about vampire connection, I don't know. But I mean, it's a curiosity. And again, we've got these moat safes, which were assumed to keep grave robbers out. But the other side of it was it to keep vampires in? Were we trying to stop people who turned into vampires getting out? You tend to think, oh, it's these strange people in Eastern Europe. They're the ones that are so kind of, if you like, got this superstitious attitude. But I mean, people were superstitious in, 19th century, even today. So I mean, you had this view of things. Don't necessarily assume that we were trying to stop grave robbers. Could be the other way around. We're trying to stop people getting out. Another ray from the past, the incubus, somebody who was supposed to invade women's bedroom at night, take away their souls, and the female equivalent to take away men's souls. And is it from the past? Because I know that Alison, who spoke this morning, documented some of these incidents in a book, Mystic Visions. So although you kind of think of it as an old kind of supernatural belief about the succubus and incubus, it's carried on even until comparatively recent times. But most people, again, don't see these creatures. And the alluring mermaid, they're always alluring. This is another kind of, from the past, shapeshifter. The mermaid, the beautiful mermaid, who was, to attract some poor bloke into the water and then drown him, or alternatively would be captured, taken on shore, sort of turned into a woman, an ordinary woman if you like, and eventually head back into the sea at some point. My point, okay, where have all the mermaids gone? I mean, there are reports right up into the 19th century, even the early 20th century, of encountering mermaids. But again, it's one of these entities which seems to have disappeared out of our consciousness. People don't see mermaids anymore. Why not? And ditto with sea monsters. Some fantastic tales of giant sea monsters, as it were, attacking ships and dragging ships down, even again into the earliest 20th century, where supposedly a submarine in the Irish coast was attacked by this sea monster. Again, there's obviously doubt about whether this ever happened, and like some of these tales. But certainly, there's documented cases of ships being encountered by sea monsters, but again, where have they all gone? Seem to have disappeared. People just don't seem to have these incidents or experiences anymore. And our good old friend, the werewolf, made some fantastic films out of it, I have to say, but, long tradition of encounters with werewolves, to a certain extent in Scotland, but certainly in Europe, there's lots of stories about coming across werewolves. But again, the werewolf has disappeared. But what do we get today? These strange entities, they've changed into something else. Now we see different things. Bigfoot, of course. It's not a very good picture, but you've probably seen pictures of it. Is it somebody dressed up in a gorilla suit? Is it a genuine experience? I mean, if you go on the TV channels, of course, there's endless stories of folk hunting Bigfoot or seeing Bigfoot. So it's a beast of today. And, sorry, that's just probably a made-up photo, but you know the idea of black cat. There's massive black cats seen these days, all over the place, Why has that suddenly happened? I mean, they talk about cats and being released after 1975, but in the past, will they seen so frequently? No, but we see them today. And dogman, here's something that's just exploded onto the scene recently. You get reports of people having seen dogman. I mean, somebody said they saw it up near Dachman Law, the Bob Taylor experience in West Lothian there, and people started seeing dogman. Why? Why dogman? Where's he come from? And the Yeti too, I mean, how long? I mean, I know there's been these stories about the Yeti, but it's only merging into our consciousness in comparatively recent years. It'll become one of these kind of like threatening or semi-threatening beasts, and there have been reports of the Yeti in Scotland, in the Cairngorms, a Yeti-like beast, hairy, huge. So it's not just over in the Himalayas. So, just to conclude, what monsters will we create in the future? Are we creating these monsters? Is it something in human consciousness or something in the human psyche that sort of generates the kind of threatening monsters of today, or the threatening monsters of the future? And finally, I'll plug Malcolm Robinson's and I's latest book, which has absolutely nothing to do with this talk, but I'm mentioning it anyway. So thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you very much, Ron. So again, we'll have a short break, just 10 minutes or so while we get the stage ready and everything for our penultimate speaker. And for those